Deep in the basement of HMP Wakefield, there's a room unlike any other in the British penal system. There's no iron bars, there's no view of the yard, no sunlight, no contact with the outside world, just a solid steel door, bulletproof glass, and a few pieces of furniture. Inside it sits a man who hasn't walked among the general population of the prison in over 40 years. He reads, he listens to classical music, most of all, he waits. The press called him a vigilante, a monster. They even fabricated rumors that he was a cannibal, earning a nickname straight out of the Hollywood nightmare. But the reality of what put Robert Mauldsley inside this glass cell, the brutal and calculated violence he unleashed on his fellow inmates, it's far more chilling than the tabloids could ever dare to print. Welcome back to Homicidal Tendency. I'm your host, Matt. Today, we're descending into the solitary confinement ward of Wakefield Prison to look at the UK's most dangerous prisoner. But before we unlock the heavy steel doors and get into the unsettling details of today's case, I want to take a quick second and say thank you for joining me today. If you're enjoying the show, the absolute best way to support it is by taking a moment and leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It's a massive help in getting the podcast in front of new listeners who love the dark and the macabre as much as we do. Also, make sure you're following along on the social media. I'll be posting all the visual evidence from today's episode, including photos of Maudsley and the infamous Wakefield basement cell, over on Instagram. You can find me at Homicidal Tendency. You can also find me on Blue Sky at Homicidal Tendency or Homicidal Pod on X, and we're also on Reddit and TikTok at Homicidal Tendency. But wherever you find me, give us a follow and let me know what you think about today's case. All right, housekeeping over. Make sure your doors are locked, settle in, and let's head back to 1974 to find out exactly what it takes to get locked inside a glass box for 40 years. The story of how Robert John Maudsley became the man in the glass cell doesn't start with a murder. It starts in June 1953 in Liverpool. He was the fourth of 12 children. Before he was even 2 years old, Robert and 3 of his siblings were removed from their parents' home due to neglect. They were sent to Nazareth House, a Roman Catholic orphanage run by nuns. By all accounts, this was the only peaceful period of Robert's early life. He was safe, he was cared for, and he formed a tight bond with his siblings. But the system failed him. When Robert was 8 years old, his parents decided they wanted their children back. During the several years that Robert and his 3 older siblings were living at the Nazareth House orphanage, George and his wife went on to have the remaining 8 children. This massive household size likely contributed to the chaotic and dangerous environment the older children were thrust back into when their parents suddenly decided to reclaim them. The transition from Nazareth House back to his parents was deeply disturbing and jarring. His brother Paul later recalled that the nuns had felt like their real family. When their biological parents took them back, they were virtually strangers to them. Paul noted that the parents would pick on the children one by one, administer a beating, and then send them back to their rooms. However, the most extreme and targeted violence was always reserved for Robert. Robert later recalled being locked in a small room for 6 months. His father would unlock the door 4 to 6 times a day for one reason only, and that was to beat him. He was struck with sticks, rods, and on one occasion, his father completely shattered a .22 caliber air rifle on his back. Robert also alleged later that his father sexually abused him. Eventually, social services intervened again, pulling Robert out of the home and placing him in a string of foster care setups. In a final twisted act of cruelty, his father simply told the rest of his siblings that Robert had died. To really understand how a deeply traumatized 16-year-old Robert slipped so completely through the cracks, we have to talk about what London actually looked like in the early 1970s. If you're picturing the glamorous, neon-lit swinging 60s, erase that from your mind. By the time Robert arrived, the UK was slipping into a severe economic crisis. It was an era of mass strikes, rolling blackouts, uncollected garbage piling up on the sidewalks, and a massive wave of urban decay. And for runaway youth, the epicenter of this bleak new world was Piccadilly Circus. At the time, the area around Piccadilly was notoriously known as being the meat rack. It was the primary gathering space for the city's dilly boys, these hundreds of young homeless male runaways who survived by doing sex work. The danger that these boys faced is hard to overstate. While homosexuality between consenting adults over the age of 21 had been partially decriminalized in the UK in 1967, the scene was still heavily policed and deeply stigmatized. Because Robert was only a teenager, everything he was doing to survive was completely illegal, pushing him into the deepest, darkest corners of the underground. If a client became violent, a rent boy couldn't exactly go to the police for help. They were entirely unprotected. To cope with the cold, the hunger, and the constant threat of violence, this underground community was heavily reliant on drugs. The city was seeing a massive influx of heroin and barbiturates. Runaways would crash in the freezing derelict squats, getting high just to numb the realities of what they had to do when the sun went down. This was Robert's entire world. He wasn't living. He was existing in a perpetual state of prey. He was a severely abused, deeply mentally ill kid, heavily addicted to drugs, wandering through an economically depressed city, getting into the cars of strangers who knew nobody would come looking for him if he disappeared. During this period, his mental health was completely unspooling. He was actively dying. Robert was bouncing in and out of psychiatric hospitals across London. He had made suicide attempts. He was desperately crying out for help, explicitly telling doctors that he was experiencing violent auditory hallucinations and the urge to kill. Time and time again, the system patched him up just enough to discharge him right back out on the streets. This was the volatile cocktail that the London streets created. A young man could be completely broken by childhood abuse, dependent on drugs, profoundly mentally ill, and constantly placed in dangerous transactional situations with older men. By the spring of 1974, 20-year-old Robert was a ghost haunting the streets of London. He was heavily addicted to drugs and entirely dependent on sex work to survive. It was during this time, in the Wood Green area of North London, that he crossed paths with a 30-year-old laborer named John Farrell. To Robert, Farrell was just another client, another stranger's car to get into, another transaction to keep the withdrawals at bay. He agreed to go back to Farrell's flat. We do not know the exact progression of the evening, but at some point inside the flat, the dynamic shifted. Farrell felt comfortable enough with the young, marginalized rent boy to reveal his darkest secret. He pulled out a collection of photographs and showed them to Robert. They were pictures of children that Farrell had sexually abused. Farrell couldn't have known what he had just done. He was sitting across from a young man who had been locked in a room for 6 months, beaten daily, and raped by his own father. A young man who had been telling doctors for years that the violent voices in his head were screaming for him to kill. Looking at those photos, Robert didn't just see the victims, he saw himself. Something inside it fundamentally shattered. The years of suppression, agonizing trauma, it ignited into pure blind rage. He attacked Farrell. He beat him, and in a brutal, desperate frenzy, Maudsley garroted the 30-year-old laborer to death right there in his flat. He strangled him so slowly and with such sustained force that Farrell's face was completely discolored by the time he died. In fact, long before the press ever called him Hannibal the Cannibal, this specific set of details earned Maudsley his very first dark moniker in the prison system. They simply called him Blue. But what happened next is just as telling about Maudsley's mental state. He didn't run. He didn't try to hide the body or cover his tracks. Instead, Robert walked out of that flat, found the nearest police station, and turned himself in. He freely admitted to the killing. He told the police exactly what had happened, and he begged them for psychiatric help. He knew his mind was broken, and he thought, finally, the system would lock me away and fix me. He was deemed unfit for trial for the murder. Instead, the courts ordered him to be detained indefinitely at Broadmoor Hospital, England's most notorious high security. When Robert Maudsley walked into Broadmoor Hospital in 1974, he believed he was finally going to get the psychiatric help he needed. When you hear hospital, you might picture sterile white walls and fluorescent lights, but Broadmoor, it's entirely different. It opened in 1863 during the Victorian era. It's located in the village of Crowthorne in Berkshire. Architecturally, the original buildings look more like looming red brick Gothic fortresses or an imposing asylum out of a horror movie, more than a modern mental health facility. It's a high security psychiatric hospital. The people sent there, they're not deemed evil in the eyes of the law, they're deemed violently and severely criminally insane. Because of this, security is tighter than it is in most traditional maximum security prisons. It has massive perimeter walls, intricate alarm systems, and staffs trained to handle the most unpredictable, volatile patients in the country. Broadmoor housed some of the most infamous figures in British criminal history. Some of the more notable inpatients include Peter Sutcliffe, otherwise known as the Yorkshire Ripper, one of UK's most terrifying serial killers who murdered 13 women and attempted to murder 7 others between 1975 and 1980. He spent over 30 years at Broadmoor after being diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia before eventually being moved to a mainstream prison. Then we get to Ronnie Cray, one half of the infamous Cray twins, who essentially ran organized crime in London's East End during the 1950s and 60s. Ronnie was certified insane and lived out the last 16 of his years in Broadmoor. Then there's Charles Bronson, often dubbed Britain's most violent prisoner. Like Maudsley, Bronson spent massive chunks of his life in solitary confinement due to his extreme, relentless violence against the prison staff and other inmates. He spent time in Broadmoor in the late 70s and 80s, where he notably staged massive protests and rooftop standoffs. And then there's Ian Ball, the man who infamously tried to kidnap Princess Anne at gunpoint in 1974. Putting Robert in a facility filled with the exact type of predators he despised was like throwing a lit match into a powder keg. Fast forward to 1977. Maudsley had been in Broadmoor for 3 years. On his ward was a 26-year-old patient named David Francis. Francis wasn't just another inmate, he was a convicted child molester. So I'm pretty sure you know where this is going. Once again, he was face to face with the embodiment of his own childhood trauma. And this time, he didn't snap in a sudden blind rage. This time, it was cold, calculated, and deeply sadistic. He teamed up with another patient, a man named David Cheeseman. Together, they cornered Francis inside a cell and barricaded the door so securely the hospital staff couldn't immediately breach it. What followed was 9 hours of sheer, uninterrupted agony. While the guards and staff were trapped outside, Maudsley and Cheeseman subjected Francis to horrific torture. They beat him relentlessly, they suspended him from the ceiling, and they shoved makeshift weapons into his ears. For almost an entire shift, the staff could do nothing but listen to the brutality unfolding on the other side of that door. Finally, after hours of torment, Maudsley garroted Francis to death. When the staff finally broke through the door, they found Francis's head had been severely smashed. And this right here is where the myth of Robert Maudsley was born. When the press got a hold of the story, they didn't just report the facts, they sensationalized the gore to agree that cemented Maudsley into British true crime infamy. Tabloids ran a wild rumor that when the guards entered the cell, they found Maudsley with a spoon, eating pieces of David Francis' brain right out of his cracked skull. And let's be really clear, incredibly clear, it did not happen. Autopsy reports and official inquiries absolutely confirm there was no cannibalism. Maudsley himself denied it for the rest of his life, but the truth didn't matter to the media. Overnight, they branded him the Brain Eater and Hannibal the Cannibal. They also called him Spoons because he was supposedly eating the brain with spoons. Those nicknames, they stuck. Despite committing a gruesome murder inside a psychiatric hospital, he was found ultimately fit to stand trial for the death of David Francis. He was convicted of manslaughter and permanently transferred out of the hospital system. Surprisingly, Maudsley deeply resented the transfer. He openly stated that he disliked the mainstream prison environment and made it clear he actually wanted to be sent back to Broadmoor. However, Broadmoor Hospital, a facility designed to handle the most dangerous psychiatric patients in the country, they looked at the aftermath of the cell and threw up their hands. They declared Maudsley too dangerous and too uncontrollable for a hospital. Like we said, the British justice system looked at Robert and what he had done at Broadmoor and decided he was no longer a patient, he was a prisoner. Wakefield isn't just a prison. It's a Category A fortress designed to hold the absolute worst the United Kingdom has to offer. The concentration of high-profile murderers and sex offenders inside the walls is so dense, the British public gave it a very specific nickname, the Monster Mansion. Over the years, this facility has housed Harold Shipman, the doctor that murdered over 200 of his own patients. It's held Colin Ireland, the serial killer who was specifically hunting gay men across London in the 1990s, and a primary holding facility for the country's most notorious child murderers like Ian Huntley. This was the environment they dropped Robert into. Think about the catastrophic failure of that decision. You have a man whose entire psychological break was triggered by severe childhood abuse. A man who'd already murdered 2 people purely because they were sex offenders. And the system's grand solution was to lock him inside a building packed to the rafters with the exact type of predators he was hunting for. It wasn't a punishment, it was a buffet. And on July 29th, 1978, Maudsley decided it was time to eat. It was a Saturday. He had targeted 2 specific inmates. The first was a 46-year-old man named Salney Darwood, who was serving a life sentence for the manslaughter and sexual assault of his own wife. Maudsley calmly invited Darwood into his cell. Once the door was closed, he overpowered him. Maudsley garroted him and stabbed him and slit his throat, according to reports, before hiding the body under the bed. Maudsley didn't panic. He didn't run. He just waited. And then, a few hours later, he left his cell and walked down the wing to find his second target, 56-year-old William Roberts. Roberts was serving time for attempting to sexually assault a 4-year-old girl. Let me say that one more time. A 4-year-old girl. Maudsley slipped into Roberts' cell carrying a makeshift knife he had fashioned out of a soup spoon. He brutally stabbed Roberts to death, ultimately smashing the man's head against the cell wall with devastating force. So there we have it, 2 murders, one day, under the noses of the guards in one of the most secure prisons in the United Kingdom. The way Maudsley handled the immediate aftermath is perhaps the most chilling part of the entire story. Covered in blood, he calmly walked out of Robert's cell and strolled straight up to the wing of the officer's desk. He placed his makeshift blood-soaked knife down on the guard's desk, looked the officer dead in the eyes, and told him that they were going to be 2 men short for the next roll call. Maudsley had made his point. He had exacted the vengeance on the monsters he believed deserved to die. And he proved the prison system, they couldn't control him. At this point, the government realized they had a man they couldn't put into a hospital, and they couldn't safely put into a prison. So they built him a cage. Deep in the basement of the facility, they merged 2 existing cells to create a 5.5 by 4.5 meter room. This wasn't a standard solitary confinement cell. They completely removed the traditional iron bars. In their place, they installed thick, bulletproof plexiglass. The cell features a solid steel outer door that opens into a smaller cage within the room. Everything he needs, his food, his mail, his meager supplies, is passed through a specially designed, secured tiny slot at the bottom of the enclosure. Now, if hearing the description of this custom-built bulletproof glass cell in a prison basement is setting off massive pop culture alarm bells in your head right now, you're right. You're exactly on the right track. It sounds identical to the iconic setup holding Dr. Hannibal Lecter in The Silence of the Lambs. The parallels are so incredibly specific, it's almost impossible to untangle the myth of Robert Maudsley from the fictional character of Hannibal Lecter. Think about it. You have a highly lethal killer completely isolated in a subterranean unit, locked behind reinforced glass instead of iron bars. He has his meals slid through a tiny slot, and he spends endless days reading and listening to classical music. But here's where the timeline gets really interesting, and we have to separate the facts from the Hollywood fiction. Did Robert Maudsley inspire the character of Hannibal Lecter? Actually, no. The author Thomas Harris published the first book featuring Hannibal Lecter. It was called Red Dragon in 1981. This was 2 full years before Wakefield Prison ever built Maudsley's glass cell. Harris actually based Lecter on a cartel doctor he met in a Mexican prison in the 1960s. But the British tabloid press saw the undeniable similarities between this fictional, terrifying cannibal and the real life killer locked in their own prison system, especially because of the completely fabricated 1977 rumor about Maudsley eating his victim's brain. So that gets us to where the media essentially lifted the nickname straight out of pop culture and slapped onto Maudsley, officially branding him Hannibal the Cannibal. That being said, when it came time to actually film the movie The Silence of the Lambs in 1991, the visual design of Lecter's cinematic glass cage is practically a carbon copy of the very real box that Robert Maudsley had already been living in for almost a decade. It's a chilling case of life imitating art. But anyways, back to our story here. For over 40 years, the glass box has been Robert's entire world. He's locked inside for 23 hours a day. For that one remaining hour being his exercise time, he's allowed to exercise in a designated yard, but he's never alone. He is escorted by up to 6 prison officers, and he is absolutely forbidden from having any contact with any other inmates. He is entirely, profoundly isolated. When you lock a human being in a subterranean glass box for 23 hours a day, year after year, decade after decade, what happens to their mind? For Robert, the answer was a slow, agonizing deterioration. He wasn't just isolated from other inmates, he was isolated from the basic experience of being alive. No grass to touch, no direct sunlight, no physical touch, just the sterile hum of the ventilation system and the endless walls of gray concrete. In the year 2000, after living in a glass cell for 17 years, Maudsley reached a breaking point. He wrote a formal petition to the prison authorities, and the contents of these letters were eventually leaked to the press. They offer a rare, deeply unsettling look inside the mind of the man the media called a monster. In his letter, he didn't ask for freedom. He knew he was never getting out. He simply begged for a single shred of companionship. He formally requested permission to keep a pet bird in his cell. He wrote, "I promise I'll love it and I'll never harm it. I just want something to care for." He tried to explain that the absolute void of his existence, stating that the prison authorities had effectively buried him alive in a concrete coffin. He described his daily life as one long, unbroken period of profound depression. But it was the alternative he offered that truly highlighted his depression. Maudsley told the prison board that if they couldn't find it in their hearts to let him have a small bird to talk to, he had a backup request. "If the prison service says no," he wrote, "then I will ask for a simple cyanide capsule, which I shall willingly take. And the problem of Robert John Maudsley can easily and swiftly be resolved. A bird or a suicide pill. Those were the only 2 options he felt he had left." The prison authorities reviewed his petition. They denied the bird, and of course, they denied the cyanide. They simply left him in a box, and he's still waiting there today. The entire narrative of the glass cell is built on a single terrifying premise that Robert Maudsley is a monster, a creature so fundamentally broken and evil that he simply cannot exist among other human beings. That's the story the tabloids sold, and it's the story the prison system relies on to justify his endless isolation. But there's another side to the story, and it comes from the people who actually share his blood. In recent years, Robert's nephew, Gavin Maudsley, has stepped forward to speak publicly about his uncle. Gavin's perspective completely shatters the Hannibal the Cannibal myth that the media spent decades constructing. Gavin doesn't excuse the murder, he fully acknowledges the extreme violence his uncle committed, but he's actively campaigning to humanize the man locked inside the basement of the Wakefield prison. To his family, Robert isn't a boogeyman. He is a tragic, deeply failed victim of a system that refused to help him. Gavin has publicly pointed out a devastating truth about the timeline of the crimes back in 1974. After Robert committed his very first murder, the killing of the child abuser John Farrell, he didn't run. He walked straight into a police station and explicitly asked for psychiatric help. He knew his mind was broken from the horrific abuse he had suffered as a child, and he practically begged the system to fix him. Instead of providing that help, the system threw a traumatized, volatile young man into a highly secure hospital filled with the exact type of predators that destroyed his childhood. Gavin argues that if his uncle had actually received the psychiatric intervention he sought in 1974, the subsequent murders, the 3 brutal killings inside the prison system, they would have never happened. The system didn't just fail Robert by throwing him into the deep end of Broadmoor without proper treatment. They essentially armed the bomb. It's a chilling perspective that cuts to the core of what we do here at Homicidal Tendency as a true crime podcast. We spend a lot of time looking at the monsters that are hiding in the dark. But Gavin's campaign forces us to ask a much more uncomfortable question. What happens when the system we rely on to protect us is the exact same system that built the monster in the first place? And that brings us to the final, most uncomfortable question of the entire case. It's the debate that has kept Robert Mauldsley's name alive in British true crime circles for almost a half a century. When you look at the cold hard facts of his victimology, a very distinct pattern emerges. Farrell, a man who abused children. Francis, a convicted child molester. Darwood, a man who sexually assaulted and killed his own wife. Roberts, a man who attempted to assault a 4-year-old girl. In 40 years, Robert Maudsley never attacked a prison guard. He's never attacked the medical staff. He never went after a bank robber, a burglar, a fraudster. He exclusively hunted down men who preyed on the absolute most vulnerable members of society. The very same type of men who completely destroyed his own childhood. Because of this, a very dark, quiet debate has always surrounded him. Is Robert Maudsley a cold-blooded serial killer who belongs in a glass box? Or is he a broken, traumatized vigilante who did what a lot of people secretly wish they could do to monsters? Did they lock him in that basement to protect the public? Or did they lock him away because he exposed the fact that the system itself was completely powerless to control the predators living inside its own walls? We talk a lot about the nature of evil on Homicidal Tendency, but like I said, cases like this force us to ask, what happens when a monster only eats monsters? I'll let you be the judge of that. And that, my friends, that closes the heavy steel door on this week's episode. If you enjoyed descending into the darkness with us today, the best way you can support the show is to spread the word. Take a quick second and pull up Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leave us a 5-star rating, or maybe a written review if you feel like it. Tell us your thoughts on the Maudsley case. It's the number one way to help other fans find the show and our community. And like I said, for visual evidence from today's case, including photos of Maudsley and the infamous glass cell, come hang out on me on the social medias. You can find me on Instagram at Homicidal Tendency. You can find me on X at Homicidal Pod. And you can also find me on Blue Sky and Reddit at Homicidal Tendency. Finally, make sure you hit that follow or subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening on so you'll never miss an episode. But until next time, stay safe and don't trust the shadows.